The state of the elephant in America is better, but not great. Not when zoos and traveling shows continue. And now there's a new nemesis, artificial insemination. And the fight to stop that is a little-known casualty of the government shutdown. Elephant Matters, next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, Elephant Matters, from a ban on roadside zoos and traveling shows to artificial insemination.
Elephants so rarely breed in captivity that zoos are turning to this highly experimental and highly invasive artificial insemination process where, it involves insertion of probes and catheters and scopes into an elephant's reproductive tract. It takes hours to perform, and it's typically repeated many times each cycle where the animal has to stand still for hours at a time. And this occurs over years before an elephant ever conceives and ultimately may never give birth to a live calf who she gets to take care of. So it's really horrific, and that's why PETA advocates for an end to elephant breeding.
PETA Foundation Associate Director of Captive and Animal Law Enforcement, Rachel Mathews, talking about the methods that zoos are using to replenish their aging and dying elephant stock. With states banning zoos and even importation of elephants, artificial insemination is a new horror on top of the old, mere captivity. What you can do for the elephants next on the PETA Podcast. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. It's our 50th show, and we're closing in on the end of our first year. Thank you for being a listener. Please share a link with friends, or your enemies even. Make them friends. You all love animals. Let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And if you have a moment, please help us grow even more by filling out a short survey you'll find in the show notes of this podcast. And if you just found us, keep binging. From PETA President and co-founder Ingrid Newkirk on episode 1 to the latest one, we cover topics from fighting big cat declawing to the abuses that go into your wool garment or your Angora sweater or your Canada Goose jacket. We talk about going vegan and how PETA has saved millions of lives by changing government regulations on testing. Remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. Elephants in America can't be doing that well if most are still in captivity. From traveling shows and roadside zoos to established zoos, none of it is good. And as local and regional governments begin to move toward banning zoos and the importation of elephants, zoos are turning to artificial insemination to spawn a new generation of elephants in captivity. But the good news is PETA's fight for one elephant, Nosey, has led to a new law that could be a model for other states to help protect elephants. And PETA continues the fight for elephant freedom, going after elephant breeders on a federal level. Here's my conversation with PETA Foundation Associate Director of Captive and Animal Law Enforcement, Rachel Mathews, on the PETA Podcast. Rachel, in talking about elephants, let's start with the good news, because there's been a lot in the last month or so. Tell us about Nosey's Law. And who is Nosey and why has a law been named after?
Nosey is an African elephant who PETA campaigned for years because for so many years she was shackled in chains, carted around the country, and forced to give rides and perform tricks, even though she was suffering from painful arthritis and a horrific skin condition. Luckily, in 2017, she was seized by an animal control officer in Alabama And ever since then, she's been living at the elephant sanctuary in Tennessee. But before she was seized, she inspired a huge movement of people who were horrified by this sick and crippled elephant who was traveling around the country and forced to give rides. And she inspired a lawmaker in New Jersey to enact the first ban on traveling wild animal performances.
I recall Nosey through the years. She has been a kind of a cause celeb, and her case has inspired people all over the world. Why New Jersey?
Well, in 2015, Nosey was at the New Jersey State Fair, and Senator Raymond Lesniak heard about her, and he was horrified, and rightfully so. And there were also protests, and people were calling him to complain about this crippled and just totally unwell elephant who was alone and not being cared for at the New Jersey State Fair. Senator Lesniak actually worked with PETA to call for the New Jersey government to deny a permit to Hugo Liebel, who's Nosey's exhibitor, and he didn't really get anywhere with that. So, being a lawmaker, he decided he would just change the law, and that led to the first iteration of Nosey's Law, which he introduced. That would have banned elephants in traveling circuses and other traveling acts. The legislature passed it easily and actually amended it to expand it to include other wild animals, but it ended up being pocket vetoed under the previous administration. So it had to be reintroduced, and it sailed through the legislature and was just signed last month in December.
So now the ban is all animals, including tigers, all exotic animals, or just elephants?
It's most wild animals. There's a defined list of animals, but yes, it includes pretty much all of the wild animals who you see in traveling shows today. So tigers, lions, elephants, bears, other common animals who are not only in circuses, but also who show up at fairs and other events like that.
Now, this is the first state in the nation to ban circuses and carnivals, but there have been other states that have had laws similar to this. Like New Jersey this is the first state, but Illinois and New York also banned the use of elephants in traveling acts?
That's right. In 2017, Illinois and New York became the first states to ban the use of elephants in traveling acts. And then just after Nosey's Law passed in New Jersey, Hawaii enacted a regulation that effectively bans wild animals in circuses by preventing circuses from importing wild animals into the state.
Now, the difference between circus and traveling acts, is that a significant thing? I mean, Illinois and New York just banned the traveling acts. Does that include circuses?
That does include circuses. So to the animal, there's not really a difference. You know, the lifestyle is the same. There are tigers who are caged, elephants are chained and confined to trailers. So the conditions are very much the same, as is the kind of training that's used on these animals. Elephants are trained with bull hooks, which are sharp metal-tipped weapons that look like fireplace pokers. Tigers are controlled with whips and prods. So the issues are the same. It's just that the format is slightly different when it comes to a circus versus a show at a fair.
And what is the significance now of New Jersey doing its law? And are we going to start seeing a kind of a bandwagon effect where other states look at what it's done and say, maybe we should ban circuses from having these kind of animals too?
It's funny. States are sometimes reluctant to be the first to do something. But now that we have New Jersey being the first and Hawaii being the second, I'm sure that New York and Illinois will expand their laws to include other wild animals, and we will see more and more states actually adopting these kinds of laws. The other thing is that cities and counties across the country is really where this began. So this was something that began at the local level, where you saw cities like Richmond, Virginia, Sebring, Florida, Austin, Texas, were banning wild animals in traveling performances or the weapons used to control them. And once there was a critical mass of cities and towns that were doing this, the state started doing it as well.
But once you start seeing these bans, if one is a purveyor of these kind of shows and these kind of traveling acts, you just move to a state that might allow it, right? I mean, they can go to Kansas or Missouri, or they can go to North Dakota, South, anywhere, right?
Sure. I mean, that's unfortunately the nature of traveling acts, is that they're mobile. And so that's why, for example, a ban is so much more important than expecting individual cities or individual law enforcement officers to try and regulate the welfare of animals, because these animals are moving from town to town so quickly. So for years, there has been a federal law called the Traveling Exotic Animal Protection Act that has been introduced. It hasn't yet gotten traction, but I'm sure that we are not far from ultimately having national legislation that curtails this kind of exploitation of wild animals.
So maybe instead of a piecemeal approach state by state, the feds get in the act and maybe Congress steps in?
Eventually, yes. That would be the best solution, would be a federal law. But for now, where we're seeing the action is at the state level, and it's accomplishing a lot. I mean, Illinois, for example, when it banned traveling elephant acts, that was a huge center for circuses that travel with elephants that no longer can bring their elephants to the state. So that's a major financial loss to them.
Right now, we're in winter, and is there still a circuit where they go? Do they go to the Southwest? Do they keep moving, or are the traveling acts and the roadshow circuses, are they kind of dormant during this time of year?
December and January do tend to be pretty quiet when it comes to circuses. There are a couple of circuses that perform in Florida. They do, a couple days in Florida, but usually that's sort of the time off for circuses. They'll get started back up towards the end of January, and then we'll go through the end of November.
And once again, how bad are these traveling acts? How hard are they on the elephants and on the animals?
Well, elephants don't perform tricks because they want to, and tigers don't perform tricks because they want to. They do it because they have been beaten, chained, and abused behind the scenes, and they know the consequences if they don't listen to their trainers. On top of that, being caged and confined takes an immense toll on the animals' bodies and on their minds. That's why you see elephants who sway back and forth, or tigers who pace back and forth in their cages. Those are animals who are trying to soothe themselves because they have this environment that they can't control. It's boring, it's stressful. On top of that, they're often in physical pain. Elephants like Nosey develop arthritis. They develop foot problems, and it takes an immense toll on their bodies, and they often die far younger than their wild counterparts.
And so if these shows are banned and the elephants and the animals can't be used in this way, what happens when the shows shut down, or when the shows are prevented from using the animals? Is there a place for Nosey and these other animals to go to?
Absolutely. There are 2 accredited sanctuaries in the United States that take elephants. One is the Performing Animal Welfare Society in California, and the other is the Elephant Sanctuary in Tennessee. And these facilities provide specialized care for elephants who have suffered in lives of abuse and exploitation. So they provide vast habitats to roam, expert care, trees for the elephants to knock down, mud for them to wallow in, and ponds to swim in. And the animals get the freedom to do it on their own terms, which goes so far to help them heal physically and psychologically.
And so much better than a circus. And certainly there's a happy ending if we can get all the circuses and traveling shows banned.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. PETA also recently criticized the Pittsburgh Zoo over its elephant breeding plans, and even filed a complaint with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. What does the Pittsburgh Zoo want to do with elephants?
So the Pittsburgh Zoo is trying to breed elephants into captivity. And this PETA's complaint with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually started back in 2017 when an elephant named Nosey gave birth to a calf at the Pittsburgh Zoo's so-called International Conservation Center, which is a breeding facility. The zoo ended up claiming that the calf wasn't producing milk, so it took her away from her mother within a day or two of the calf's birth. It moved her 90 miles away to the Pittsburgh Zoo, where she would be raised by humans. And the calf was sick. She was miserable, according to the zoo's own words. And yet it put her on display, and that was within the first weeks of her life. The calf ultimately ended up dying at just 3 months old. And at the time, PETA called for the zoo to end its elephant program.
This idea of breeding, they had breeding plans. So that to replace the elephant, they were going to breed elephants?
Zoos breed elephants in order to because elephants actually do very poorly in captivity, and it's very hard for zoos to get a hold of elephants. So in order to keep their exhibits stocked, zoos do everything they can to try and get elephants to breed. In some cases, they resort to experimental and highly invasive artificial insemination efforts. That wasn't the case in this case. The calf who died in 2017 was not the product of artificial insemination. But after the calf died, the zoo applied for a permit to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to allow it to import elephant semen to continue doing artificial insemination efforts on other calves. And that was despite the fact that this calf died. And on top of that, PETA uncovered records from the U.S. Department of Agriculture showing that the zoo and its breeding facility were unprepared for the birth of the calf and incapable of giving her the best chance at survival in the company of her own mother.
So the zoo showed it had a lousy track record in elephant care, essentially.
Essentially, yes. And this was information that, as far as we know, was never disclosed to the Fish and Wildlife Service when it decided to issue a permit to the Pittsburgh Zoo to continue breeding elephants. So what these inspection reports showed was that the zoo wasn't prepared for this elephant Nosey to give birth. It was incapable of giving the calf the best shot at survival in the company of her own mother, and it made reckless decisions that put both elephants at risk.
So PETA wanted to stop the zoo from getting elephant semen, essentially, right?
Yes, exactly.
And yet the zoo said, hey, this is complaints for show. We have the semen, and we're going to do this anyway. What is that? Because the zoo responded to the complaint and said, and essentially said that, PETA didn't know what it was talking about.
Yes. So the permit was actually applied for. The zoo applied for the permit in the spring of 2018, and PETA initially opposed it then. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service then issued the permit, but at the time that the permit was issued, we believe that it had no idea about these inspection reports, which had not been made available. So in light of those new inspection reports, this new information, PETA has asked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to to revoke the permit, which was valid for a year, and also to deny any future permits because the zoo has obtained multiple permits like this in the past.
And the zoo's response was, hey, we got the semen we need. It's sort of funny.
That's right.
So, the PETA's just doing this for show. We got our semen. I don't know what they're talking about, those PETA folks. And they even tried to say that those findings, were they somehow erased or somehow expunged from the record?
So what ended up happening with the USDA inspection reports is that the Pittsburgh Zoo was able to appeal the reports. And this is something that the U.S. Department of Agriculture allows its exhibitors to do routinely. Essentially, its inspector finds violations of the Federal Animal Welfare Act and then the exhibitor is allowed to go in and appeal and say what they want changed. In this case, the USDA went out of its way to protect this animal exploiting business. And instead of publishing the true findings of its inspectors, which were highly damning, the agency caved to the Pittsburgh Zoo and removed many of the damning details from the inspection reports, even though the citations themselves stood after the appeal.
So what does this say when the regulators, the USDA, and you'll have to explain why the USDA is looking into, or why they're the regulator of the zoo, but what does it say when they're just turning a blind eye at things that they know are bad and they're letting the zoo do whatever it wants?
The U.S. Department of Agriculture, it does, as you said, it regulates animal exhibitors, among other commercial animal enterprises, but in particular animal exhibitors here. And in this case, the USDA has gone out of its way to protect animal exploiting businesses, which it calls customers. The agency, for example, used to make all inspection reports and enforcement actions public, but now it refuses to disclose most records because it might embarrass the companies that are violating the law. So this is the definition of an agency that is abdicating its duty to protect animals in favor of protecting the animal exploiters.
What is the status of PETA's complaints? And given that some of the details were retracted from the reports, are you trying to put them back in? Are you trying? Where do we stand in the case?
So right after PETA filed this complaint, or not long after PETA filed the complaint, the government went into a partial government shutdown. So I don't expect that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has taken much action on it, other than perhaps reviewing our complaint. Unfortunately, we will probably have to pester the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for a response, and that will probably include filing a Freedom of Information Act request to determine what action the agency took, because information about permits are not inherently available to the public. You have to ask for them. When it comes to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, there's no way that PETA or the public is able to change what the content of an inspection report says. So the final inspection reports that PETA released to the public, as well as the initial inspection reports, which were more damning, they showed that the zoo lacked the number of employees that it needed, that it was exposing the calf to hazards, and it ultimately put her life at risk. The most we can do is expose that and call on people to never go to this zoo that's exploiting elephants.
Now, this is pretty instructive because it really speaks to the role of the modern animal rights activists, today. I mean, well, first of all, we have the current issue of the government shutdown. People think that, if people are wondering what is affected by the temporary government shutdown that we have now, well, here's an example of something that has been effective. Things don't go through like they would. Well, things would go through slowly, as it were, right? Or in normal times, but they're even slower during a government shutdown. But the point I wanted to make was that people think that as an animal rights activist, all you do is go out there with a sign or maybe write a letter or an email. But it's far more intricate these days because you get into all these legal aspects of what, of the regulations and who are the regulated and what they're doing or not doing, and what is disclosed and not disclosed, and what is public and what has to be, really excavated with a FOIA or Freedom of Information Act request. This is hard work, this animal activism.
It sure is. And what's even harder is once you dig up this information, getting people to pay attention and to understand how incredibly important it is to these animals. This calf who was born, she died at just 3 months old, and she had an extremely short life. And the zoo was, meanwhile, proclaiming to the rooftops to get everybody to come see her while she was sick and miserable.
So Pittsburgh continues to do what it does. And one imagines they're probably trying to impregnate an elephant even as we speak.
It sure could be. The other option that it could be taking is it could potentially be distributing this semen to other zoos that are trying to do the same thing. You have to understand that elephants so rarely breed in captivity that zoos are turning to this highly experimental and highly invasive artificial insemination process where, it involves insertion of probes and catheters and scopes into an elephant's reproductive tract. It takes hours to perform, and it's typically repeated many times each cycle where the animal has to stand still for hours at a time. And this occurs over years before an elephant ever conceives and ultimately may never give birth to a live calf who she gets to take care of. So it's really horrific, and that's why PETA advocates for an end to elephant breeding in the United States.
So all these other bans of imports are forcing the zoos to do this, but you can't get them to stop trying to rectify this until you get a ban on animals, period, or ban on the elephants at circuses and zoos and that kind of thing, right?
Well, the better solution that many zoos are recognizing is that zoos simply need to close their elephant exhibits because of the cruelty inherent in confining these intelligent, social, and wide-ranging animals to confined environments. So it's time for the Pittsburgh Zoo to join these other zoos that have made that switch, and for other zoos to do so as well.
What are the so-called good zoos that have made the switch?
A great example would be the Detroit Zoo, which closed its elephant exhibit specifically because it recognized that elephants simply do not thrive in captivity, and it ended up moving its elephants to a sanctuary. And the same should go for any other zoo that is looking to the future. The fact is that elephants are simply suffering in captivity, and the population isn't sustainable. They don't breed in captivity, and it's inhumane and immoral to be taking elephants out of the wild to stock zoo exhibits as well.
And if people don't back banning the elephants in the zoos, it subjects the elephants that are in captivity to this breeding process that you described, which doesn't sound pleasant at all.
No, absolutely not. The breeding process is incredibly invasive, and it so rarely results in a viable calf. And even when it does result in a viable calf, that animal is condemned to a life in captivity that can never match a life in the wild. In the wild, elephants roam vast territories. In zoos, they're confined to spaces measured in square feet rather than square miles. They want to live in close-knit family groups, but in zoos, the elephants are moved from place to place to wherever a zoo decides they need them. On top of that, elephants spend their hours foraging and swimming and socializing and playing, but in captivity, they have very little choice or control over their lives, and their lives are dictated by the humans who can offer little to them compared to what they would see in the wild.
Now, I asked about this earlier about, whether or not there's a circuit, but is there kind of like an elephant underground traveling shows? And just like you were mentioning, how zoos could be spreading semen or dispensing semen to others who are breeding. Could the zoos be using the fact that they have semen to distribute it to like a roadside zoo, or to other people who may have a hard time getting a permit to get the semen, so that we have this really kind of, valuable contraband, this elephant semen?
So the current state of elephants in captivity, circuses and zoos are pretty separate at this point. Ringling Brothers Circus used to be sort of a major hub. They were constantly trading elephants with zoos. They currently have 2 elephants who are living at the San Antonio Zoo, for example. They have other elephants who are at other zoos. But once Ringling stopped touring and basically got out of the circus game, that has really slowed down. So Ringling is still involved, but there's less of a connection between zoos and circuses. And other circuses are simply not breeding elephants, really. The last elephant who was born in a circus, it was a few years ago, but that was a very, very rare birth. So really it comes down to zoos, and there is a what they call a species survival program where they determine which elephant needs to breed with whom, wherever in the country, however you can achieve that breeding.
So this is sort of like a Tinder for elephants kind of thing.
Kind of, except the elephants don't have any choice in it.
Yeah. Oh, they're not swiping. It's the elephant keepers who are swiping.
Exactly.
So, well, all right. Look, I just wanted to insert a little humor there, but the thing is, what can people do when they see elephants to try to help fight what's happening at zoos like the Pittsburgh Zoo, and to help further the idea of a ban of these animals in circuses and traveling shows?
The easiest thing that people can do is they can choose not to buy a ticket to a circus or to ride an elephant anywhere. There's nothing easier than that. It just means not doing something. For people who want to go a step further, you can, for example, contact your local zoo and tell them that you want the zoo to stop breeding elephants. Or you can set up a protest when the circus comes to town. Another great example would be contacting your local city council person and asking them to introduce an ordinance that would ban circuses from coming to the city. We had a really great example of an activist in Florida who got her city council members to pass a ban on bullhooks and other weapons that are used to control wild animals in circuses. So when the circus came to town the next year, she had to get that enforced. So not only did she get the ban passed, but then she went and she met with her sheriff. She met with the city council again. She met with the organizers of the circus. And she said, look, there is a bullhook ban in place. You control elephants with bullhooks, so you can't bring the elephants. She also talked to PETA, and we mobilized members who contacted the Fair Association, and ultimately the fair canceled the circus. But that's what it takes. It takes effort, and it's more than signing a petition. It's getting out there and changing your community yourself.
And Rachel, one last question for you, and thank you for being on the PETA podcast. But what keeps you motivated? This is, there's a lot of legal intricacies, and you've got to be on the ball in terms of finding all the little things that they're doing in terms of hiding evidence or taking redacting information, FOIA requests, and all that. What keeps you motivated to stay in the fight for the elephants?
I think what keeps me motivated is that after, I've worked for the PETA Foundation for 5.5 years now, and I know the elephants now. There are less than a few hundred elephants in the United States, and those who are traveling, there's even fewer. And I know them by name. I know them by sight. I know what their lives are like every single day, and I can't imagine a worse, more miserable life. So it really is the animals who motivate me. And on top of that, when we're going through these records, like the records from the Pittsburgh Zoo, realizing that the people who are exploiting these animals really don't have their best interests in mind, and that you can find that information pretty easily if you're persistent.
And when you talk about these bans on imports, and you talk about the lack of breeding that happens, when you say there's 100 elephants, we're talking about a very, very limited population that you can see how it grows or how it diminishes. I mean, it doesn't grow by leaps and bounds unless there's more importation, and we're not seeing that anymore as much. So you're dealing with a finite number in some ways?
We know every single elephant in the United States. Every single one of those elephants is documented, and we are able to track them and get to know them. So it's a unique animal issue in that luckily there are not that many elephants in the country. In zoos, it's maybe around 400 elephants, and in circuses, it's much less.
All right, Rachel, thank you for your time. Thank you for being on the PETA Podcast.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Rachel Mathews. She's with the PETA Foundation as the Associate Director of Captive and Animal Law Enforcement. And you'll note that spells out kale by design. Read about Nosey the elephant and the law that protects elephants and other wildlife in New Jersey. And read about the Pittsburgh Zoo case. There are links on the show notes. Or go to the website and take action for the elephants at PETA.org. Hey, you can contact us at PETA.org. Find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMILAMOK. Or on AMOK.com, amok.com. Find out what I'm up to. Got a show coming up on January 27th in San Francisco, February 1st, February 7th. So go to AMOK.com for details. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Emil Guillermo.